When it comes to people doing that sort of thing, where they maybe want to write about Egypt, is that funded by yourself? Are there grants? How can someone finance something like that from a business perspective? Today, I have Don Sawyer with me, and it's time to discuss not only being a teacher, but a traveling author. Don, thank you for joining me today.
Wow, geez, thanks for having me, Dan. I'm really looking forward to it. I like the whole concept, and particularly that idea of talking about not writing in isolation, but writing and teaching combined.
Talk to me about the importance of writing and as it relates to teaching and vice versa. I'll let you just dive right in.
Writing has always been something that I enjoyed and kind of came easy to me. I actually found some poems that I had in my high school literary magazine. As you can imagine, they weren't that good, but they weren't that bad either. Actually, I was kind of impressed. But for real, I went to British Columbia to do a PhD in modern Chinese history, and this was back at about 19. I had graduated at that point, 69, and I was I was defeated by the Chinese language. I think everybody around decided that I would be better off behind a water buffalo in the rice field, the rice paddies. And so I left the PhD program. And of course, at this point, that was my whole arc, my career arc, right? I was going to get this PhD and then teach Chinese history at some, esteemed university. So I think all bets were off at this point. And remember, I was an academic, so I hadn't learned how to do anything useful. Like I didn't know how to, I don't know, lay bricks or, unclog pipes. I was just, So what do you do? Well, gee, maybe somebody wants me as a teacher. I'd been in school a lot. So anyway, we kind of worked our way east because we were living in British Columbia at this time, and I sent letters of application. Remember, I didn't have any education courses whatsoever. Fortunately, my wife did. She had, most of her credits toward a teaching certificate. So by the time we hit the far east, in Newfoundland, which probably most of your listeners know is the last province to join Canada in 1949. But in those days, 1970, it was really still very traditional in many, many ways. It was a it still is a remarkable place, but even more remarkable then because it was fairly uncontaminated by the rest of us. So anyway, this one school district, the guy was so desperate, he offered my wife and me a job in this little outport community. And so without a whole lot of options, we jumped in our old two-cycle sub and out we went. And we went to this little community in just north of Gander. And we had 2 marvelous years teaching. And obviously in an environment that was quite unlike anything we'd ever been in before. And because I had no teacher training and no teacher expectations other than the bad teaching I'd experienced, I was kind of a tabula rasa, right? And so I tried things, but I really learned how to teach from my kids. And they were the ones who sort of said, yeah, that was fun. Let's try that. It was I can remember trying, I did a whole unit on Chinese philosophy, and it didn't go well. Here we are in this rural Newfoundland outport. And then what's interesting about it was that school was irrelevant really there traditionally. I mean, the skills you learned were from your parents, your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, learning how to build boats and fish and go sealing. The girls learned how to preserve food and that sort of thing. And from their mothers. And so school had just never been a factor in that community or that society. So, but things had really changed. Like in this particular community, they'd only had roads for about 9 years, but the outer world was crashing in on them. And so we later talked to the superintendent, and he was intentionally bringing teachers in from outside to kind of try to ease that transition for students. And because now, the fishery was dying and the opportunity for work outside of fisheries in the community were expanding. So they needed skills that they hadn't needed before, literacy skills, communication skills, interpersonal skills, and even intercultural skills. So we had a marvelous 2 years there. Wonderful, incredible. We learned far more, I'm sure, literally than the kids did. But during this time, I was writing letters to my friends and saying, "My gosh, this is quite a place." And so after two wonderful years, we went back I went to finish up my master's degree, and Jen finished up her her education degree. And a friend of mine said, you know, you wrote all those wonderful letters. You should write a book about this. I said, no, Tom, I can't do that. He said, oh, yeah, you can, really. I said, well, I never read that book before. He said, well, look, you got these wonderful experiences. Just kind of put them together. And so, unfortunately, my father had cancer at the time, and so we went back to be with him. And so I had a lot of time on my hands. So I started writing this book. And make a long story short, it was taken by Douglas and McIntyre, a major publisher in Canada, and much to my surprise. Much to my amazement, it became a Canadian bestseller, and I was absolutely astounded when it started to be used in teacher training programs right across the country. Because we had, you know, what do you do when you have no resources and you're in the middle of a small community? As a teacher, what do you draw on? What do you look to? And of course, the point I was trying to make was you look to the community and you look to the kids for resources and ideas. And so that was my first book, and it was called Tomorrow is School, and I'm sick to the heart thinking about it, which was from a note, because my wife and I, as you can imagine, were kind of different than the rest of the people in the community. So the kids started to come up and hang out at our house in the evenings and play darts. And so Gerald Guy left us this wonderful note. I still have it framed, showing the school being blown up. And the last line is tomorrow is school, and I'm sick to the heart thinking about it, which I always felt really poignant, and so that became the author. Anyway, as I say, that book did ridiculously well. I didn't expect it, you know, a Canadian bestseller, and so I had the experience now that you know, not only could I write a book, I could even write a fairly successful book. But you know, my life was not wrapped up in writing, which was a damn good thing, or we would have all starved to death. And so you know, I've always thought of myself as an educator who writes. And another sort of little dimension to that is this same friend of mine who got me to write my first book said that what he wants on his tombstone is, well, at least he got a book out of it. And I think that's kind of my story. You know, the experiences provided the fodder for the writing. So that's sort of an initial overview.
Wow, that's a lot of good stuff. So the one thing I really like is that, you know, and I think so many people can relate to this, even though it's different, is that, you know, you're pursuing this PhD program and you were unable to complete it. And then you said to yourself, now what?
Oh,
And I love that. I love that. I feel like that's a lot like that. A lot of people can relate to it. And that feeling of almost lost and disappointment and where do I go from here? And you looked for a solution and you came up with one and you ended up teaching. And I think that's really, really cool.
not only was it cool, it redirected my entire life in a way that was far richer and more diverse than I could have ever hoped if I'd stayed at some, you know, second rate. I mean, no offense to universities, but you know, and it got me out into the world, and I, you know, worked in Africa and all over the world.
Before you talked about writing coming very easy to you. Okay. So one thing I'd like to address, if there's something that they want a field they want to explore, a career they want to explore, but they might not have the education to support that. So in this case, someone wants to be a writer. They really want to write a book. They want to, and then maybe they don't consider themselves a good writer. What are some things they can do to improve those skills or get those skills so that they can start to go down that road?
The stock answer is, well, just write. Well, I think that's a real cop out. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that. When I taught English to adult students, many of whom had limited literacy skills, one of the things I did was we had something called a quick write. And every single morning, we started off the day with 10-minute quick write. And what a quick write was, we would come up with a topic, and you wrote without stopping for 10 minutes. And I mean, not stopping. I mean, you couldn't, you know, the pen just had to keep going. You couldn't stop to think. And it's not just my idea, other people had done it too. But it was remarkable how students became less concerned about the mechanics of writing and more able to just kind of make that connection between the brain and the paper, right? And so it was a really effective technique. So it's not that there's anything wrong with just writing, but to write well, you know, it's not a bad idea to have some skills. And so I've seen, like, a woman just the other day, a really interesting woman, former student of mine, fascinating life. She said that she wanted me to write her autobiography and her biography. And I said, no. I said, you write it. And she said, well, I don't know how to do it. I said, well, that's exactly right. So now how do you find out? So I said, are there writing courses at your local community college? And she said, yeah, I think so. And I said, what about evening courses? Yeah, she said, I think there is. In fact, I think there's an evening course on writing your own story, writing your memoir. I said, well, that would be a really good place to start. Are there writing groups in your community? Because there's a lot of writing groups, small writing groups that share their writing and support each other. And I said, try to get involved with one of those. And so my point is that there's a lot of supports out there if you look for them. And I think that that's the most important thing. And also, I think decide what success means to you as a writer. If your aspirations are to be a best-selling writer in the U.S., good luck. But I mean, go for it, but good luck. But if, like a friend of mine writes children's books, lovely books that she illustrates herself, she runs off about 35 of them and gives them to all of her family and her grandkids and all that, and that's success. And everybody has a great time. And she enjoys the writing process and all of that. So, it's, again, why are you writing? What are you writing for? What's your purpose in writing? And I mean, to be fair, I was fortunate enough to have success in my writing in terms of publication, not necessarily huge financial success, but significant success. And that was very reinforcing for me. But it also made me more aware of how I needed to become a better writer. And so as I moved into fiction and that kind of thing, I read more fiction, for one thing. How did they do that? And I looked at, like how writing books. There's some wonderful books on how to write a point of view. She said, I never thought of that. Conflict. Yeah, well, okay. I mean, it's there intuitively, but to actually understand how it works and how you can make it work, that takes a bit of a higher level of cognition, I think.
I love how you talk about success and defining success. That's fantastic because it doesn't have to be, a boatload of money. It can only be, sharing it with your kids or sharing the book with your family or something like that. I absolutely love that idea. When it comes to writing, say there's someone that they do more like, say, technical writing, or they're writing curriculum or something like that,
Yes.
and they want to try to switch over to, say, fiction writing. What kind of struggles might they encounter with that? Do they need to unlearn all these things they already learned, or are they okay, making this shift?
I certainly found that they complemented each other enormously. I mean, some of the writing I'm proudest of is the curriculum writing I did, and I've literally written thousands of pages of curriculum. Some teachers' guides related to the books I've written, but most not. I've written and edited guides for ministries at the provincial level and at the federal level. I helped coordinate and write most of the curriculum for a program in West Africa to train community development workers. And those skills are not just transferable, but the attitude and the precision of writing, the ability to take an idea, an abstract idea, and then express it in a way that others can comprehend it and act on it is quite a trick. And it's not that different, really. I mean, if I'm trying to describe a ruin bar in Budapest and I want people to be there, then I've got to know how to describe that in a way that appeals to the senses, that's clear, that's appropriate for my audience, that helps create a mental image that they can share with me. So that requires and all you've got to work with are words, right? In either situation, it's like trying to get from A to B, and sometimes it feels like you're trying to fix a watch with heavy work gloves on, right? Because but but it's the same thing. Like, and if you're good at curriculum writing, then somebody can read that, a teacher, or depending on who it's aimed at, and say, oh wow, I can see how I can do that. And then they apply that in the classroom or the training or whatever they're doing. But it's the same to me anyway. I mean, it's not creative, but it is creative. It's good. To me, creative writing, I mean, a lot of people have good ideas, and that's good. That's great. That's a good start. But unless you apply those ideas, unless you write them down, unless you you're not creating anything. So to me, creative writing is simply looking at a blank. We used to say blank page, but now we say blank screen, and do something with it. You know, put something up there, create something. So it's kind of the same idea, I think.
I have a two-part question for you. The first one's very short, and I'm going to kind of use that as a foundation for my second question. When you wrote the book for the curriculum for in Africa, okay, did you actually go to Africa for any part of that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, second part to that. When it comes to people doing that sort of thing, where they maybe want to write about Egypt, or the pyramids, and they go to Egypt or something like that, is that funded by yourself? Are there grants out from your experience? Are there grants out there? Do the other governments pay to have creatives come in? How can someone finance something like that from a business perspective?
Interesting point. In the Africa case, I was working at Okanagan University College, and that program was funded by the Canadian International Development Agency. So I wasn't going over. I mean, I was going over there to write curriculum, but I mean, I ended up going to Africa about 26, 27 times, and I think the sort of the subtext of that is, how can you write about something you don't know? And the arrogance of me trying to write a curriculum for people in Africa when I'm not there. I mean, in fact, it was a very collaborative and I think mutually rewarding process to work together. When I went to Hungary, I didn't know I was going to incorporate Hungary into a future book, but man, it really hit me. The place just really stayed with me. It has a kind of a darkness about it, but also a mystery about it. And I just found it really moving. And we went into this ruin bars, and wow, you know what ruin bars are in Hungary? They're mansions that were abandoned, many of them in World War II, largely by Jewish owners who fled Hungary because it was under Nazi control for 5 years, terrible, brutal 5 years. And they just stayed there. And then afterwards, during the communist period, there was no interest or ability to really, fix them up. So the only reason I'm telling you this is that I wrote off part of that trip as a business expense. And you can do that. I mean, legitimately. And I mean, again, it was research.
That's kind of the sort of thing I was looking for, because I've spoken to a handful of authors at this point. None of them that I've spoken with mentioned them traveling anywhere to do the writing.
Right.
And I figured you could probably do something like that. I didn't know if there'd be grants involved as well, or maybe you'd go on as part of sabbatical. But it's nice to know that these are different options that are available if you are choosing to write about different things that are outside of your immediate area. So that's really, really good information to know.
I'm not advising this. I'm not sure what the IRS. I mean, I'm in a Canadian tax system that recognizes writing expenses quite liberally. And
sure, we want people to check with their tax advisor before doing anything like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, Don, you've written about a dozen or so books. Did you run into any complications with publishing subsequent books? Was it just as easy? Was it easier to publish the second, third, fourth, fifth book once you had, the first one, the second one done? Or was it kind of like you hit a point where it's like maybe book number 6, it was like, we're not really looking for this type of, anything like that you encountered?
Book number 14, which is the one I just wrote, was my most difficult one. I guess, again, I was really spoiled because I never had difficulty really finding publishers after the first one was published. My second major book was a book called Where the Rivers Meet, based on our teaching experiences in a very small Native Indian community in the interior of British Columbia. And that was fascinating. And again, the impact of colonialism on the people and the inability of the schools to adapt to the needs and culture of the vast majority of kids there really struck us. And also our fascination and genuine interest in the native culture that was there and had sustained people there for literally thousands of years, was something that was very important for me to share. And so that book I actually sent to the publisher of Where the River of Tomorrow is School, and they rejected it on the basis that they thought the young woman in it was too sophisticated for being in high school. So I sent it to a native publishing house called Pimmican, And they got back and said, man, this is great. We love this. And they weren't, like, I don't know, they just like the Anglo house just couldn't get it. And, this, and I knew we had worked with these young people. We knew what they were capable of, what they thought, how they felt, how they, and also what they were going through. And so that one was really successful, and that again became a Canadian bestseller. So you can see I was spoiled. And that one was used in native classrooms right across the country, high school classes. And it dealt with some really difficult issues that a lot of young people are dealing with. And that's what I think made it so popular. But didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 2 years of working in native, more than that, actually, in native communities. So that one was, and then that opened up some other avenues with that publisher. And then I wrote my kids. I used to tell stories to my kids, bedtime stories, and from this dastardly teacher named Miss Flint, and so she had a silver whistle in her mouth, and she was really something. So of course I embellished the stories no end. But one Christmas, my kids said, "Okay, Dad, you got to write down the Miss Flint stories." So they gave me a little book, and so I did, and I submitted it to Thistledown. He took it like that. We did a sequel, picked up in Germany. So, I've been fortunate that way, really fortunate that way.
That is awesome. I love all of this. I love the stories that go along with it. It's so fascinating, so incredibly fascinating. Now, Don, I'm running a little short on time, but one thing I like to do whenever I'm speaking with someone, I like to give them the opportunity to talk about a project they're working on, a cause they believe in. I mean, if you want to talk more about your books or something else, I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
My current book, The Burning Gem, is the first of a trilogy. And the trilogy is called the Soul Catcher series. And that's taken from a fairly well-established understanding that in those days of when Curtis and others were trying to record Native Indian life as it was unfortunately sort of fading, many of the subjects didn't want their pictures taken because they thought these damn cameras stole part of their soul. And in a way, they were right. I mean, here you're frozen in this image that never changes, Whereas you change, you move on, but this image of you stays static. Anyway, I got to thinking, well, what if you really did have a machine that could crystallize part of your soul? And then what would that mean? What would people do with it for good or evil? And so that kind of led me to this book. But this book is now, as I say, the sequel to this, which is going to be called The Tunnels of Buddha, based on my thank you to the Canadian taxpayers, my research in Budapest. And then there's a third one, which we're kind of tentatively calling Underground at this point. But the arc of the book, even though it's urban fantasy, is that there is a cabal who wants to keep humanity separated, that wants to keep us finding our differences and emphasizing those, wants to keep us in tribal conflict constantly. And because that allows them to establish this oligarchy, very small oligarchy. And some of that's around Nietzsche's ideas, and some of those ideas are pretty dark. It's no wonder that he was Hitler's favorite, social philosopher. So what I'm trying to do with is get people to say, hey, maybe those kinds of attitudes about distrust of the other had some function in our million-year evolution, but now they're counterproductive. We're facing global challenges. Let's find ways to come together and to pool our knowledge, our culture, and to find ways to combat these issues collectively. But that's the only way we're going to do it. So that's kind of my rant, but I'm hoping that this is contained in novels that are compelling, readable, they've got magic in them, and some really, really bad guys. And of course, the jewels themselves, as we find out, have more and more import and more capacity. So it was a fun series to write. The first two are done. I'm working on the third one, and I'm really pleased to be working with Castlebridge Media, who are really fun to work with. A couple of really good guys there.
Don, that sounds really, really awesome. Combining all the magic and the urbanness and everything. That sounds like a really, really cool read. I just want to take a second again. Thank you for joining us on Time to Discuss and learning what it is like to be an author and a teacher.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, and I particularly like the fact that you are joining the two.